Order, order. We start with questions. Secretary of State for the Home Department, Shockat Adam.
Question number 1, please.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, before I respond, I'm sure the whole House will want to remember PC Rosie Pryor, who was tragically killed on Saturday while helping at the scene of an accident, and Ryan Welford, who was also killed. PC Pryor's death is a tragic reminder of the dedication and bravery that police officers show every single day to keep us safe, and all our thoughts are with her family, friends and colleagues at this difficult time. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'd like to group this response with questions 2, 11 and 17. As announced by the Prime Minister in the Plan for Change last month, we're determined to restore neighbourhood policing and to put 13,000 additional police, PCSOs and special constables back on the beat.
Shockat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to refer the House to my registered interest, and I'd also like to echo the sentiments expressed by the Home Secretary. Last year, the Leicestershire Police Panel raised serious concerns about being underfunded, in real terms a cut of 20% over the last 13 years. Due to this funding crisis, the police simply don't have enough manpower to man nighttime patrols. In the Clarendon Park area, there's been a wave of burglaries in local businesses. The Christopher James Deli, Loros and Spice Bazaar are 3 of 8 that have been smashed and grabbed over the last 2 months. At the local crime summit that I arranged to discuss the situation, one owner, Jessica and Dutta, said, "We do everything we can to survive in this incredibly difficult economic times. All we ask is the government supports us by improving policing and security." What is the Secretary of State doing to address these concerns?
Home Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, under the previous Conservative government, neighbourhood policing was decimated. The proportion who say they never see the police on the beat doubled. They took police off the beat and didn't put them back, and that's why we're setting out a neighbourhood policing guarantee. We've increased funding for police forces by £1 billion next year, including £100 million specifically to kickstart recruitment for neighbourhood policing.
Bobby Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A Carshalton resident had her car stolen from her driveway. There was video footage of this, but the police just gave her a crime reference number and closed her case. And local businesses on Wallington High Street tell me that organised shoplifters are acting with impunity. Now, I know you've touched upon the recruitment crisis being part of the solution, but what else can the government do now to help my constituents feel safe?
Secretary.
Well, the honourable member is right to talk about the deep frustration held by communities, including local businesses and town centres, not just by the absence of neighbourhood policing, which we need to turn around, but also by the weakening of powers that there has been over the last 14 years on things like shoplifting. That's why we're introducing new respect orders and strengthening powers on shoplifting and assaults on shop workers too.
Dr. Rosena Allin-Khan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We all know that well-resourced neighbourhood policing with bobbies on the beat working within the community is central, not to just solving crime, but preventing crime. And we saw some great results in Tooting just last year, with a special operation resulting in a 70% cut in crime. 14 years of Tory governments have decimated our local police teams, despite our brilliant London Mayor pulling out all the stops to bolster numbers. So can the Secretary of State pledge that our local communities will have properly resourced policing teams under the new Labour government?
Well, my honourable friend is right about the importance of having neighbourhood policing teams working in the communities with local residents, with local businesses, knowing the kinds of crimes and challenges that area faces. That's why we're determined not just to get the neighbourhood police back on the beat and to ensure that there is funding in place to do so, but also making sure that as part of a neighbourhood policing guarantee, the officers are not just abstracted to deal with other things.
Perran.
Whereas, Mr. Speaker, in 2022, the Devon and Cornwall Police Chief Constable was suspended due to misconduct. In November of last year, the interim Chief Constable was suspended as well, and now the Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner of Devon and Cornwall Police has also resigned. Does the Home Secretary share my concerns about the leadership of Devon and Cornwall Police and the impact on neighbourhood policing morale, as well as the fact that the taxpayer is now paying for 3 chief constables, 2 of whom have been suspended?
I am aware of the points that he raises, and I do have concern. It's really important that all police forces are able to strengthen their neighbourhood policing, but also have the strong leadership that goes right through the police forces too. It's why we will be setting out a new police reform white paper to make sure that we have measures in place to strengthen leadership and standards across policing.
Chair of the Select Committee, Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A focus on neighbourhood policing is welcome, and it's something that we've seen in Staffordshire for some time now. But police leaders have said that there is a risk that police officers will end up having to fill vacancies in specialist areas if they've not got the flexibility to be able to recruit as they need to. Will she listen to police leaders and give them that flexibility?
Well, we have said, as the Select Committee Chair makes an important point, we have said that the neighbourhood policing teams that we are determined to support should include police officers and PCSOs and special constables as well, who too often are underused and underappreciated, so that we make sure we recognise the mix of disciplines that you most effectively need to have strong and effective policing.
Jessica Moore.
Mr. Speaker, excellent partnership work between Gwent Police, Newport City Council and the Business Improvement District have seen crime down by 25% in our city centre at the end of the year. There's still much to do to improve confidence after neighbourhood policing was slashed under the last government. Does the Minister agree that visibility is key, and can the Home Secretary update us on police numbers in Wales?
Secretary.
My honourable friend makes an important point, because this is about visibility, it's about partnership and it's about powers. And so she rightly talks about the impact that this kind of work can have, but we also want to strengthen the work of police officers across England and Wales by also strengthening the powers that they're able to use to tackle shoplifting and street theft, snatch theft, which have both increased in recent years.
Shadow Minister Matthew Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last government left office with record police numbers, but police and crime commissioners are deeply concerned that the funding formula, the funding settlement combined with the government's national insurance tax rate will force cuts to frontline police numbers. My Labour Police Commissioner faces a £3 million shortfall, and there are projections of 3,500 officers being lost nationwide. Will the Home Secretary take responsibility if police numbers fall in the coming years?
Home Secretary.
I should just point out to the honourable member that his government took neighbourhood police off the streets. There were thousands fewer neighbourhood police officers on the streets. The number of PCSOs halved and the number of special constables dropped by 2/3. That is their shameful record, and people can see it because they know they don't see the police on the streets as a result of his government's action. And he raises the issue about funding. Well, this government has had to add an additional £170 million to police forces this year because the settlement that his party left them with was not enough to cover the pay rise this year. They let policing down.
Vickers.
She proudly quotes the funding settlement while failing to mention that £230 million of that will be snatched straight back as a result of her government's national insurance tax raid on our police forces. What can be invested in the front line of policing is largely determined by how she manages the Home Office budget. Does she agree that it was wrong to spend £10,000 on a swanky dinner for civil servants, and how will she ensure it never happens again?
Well, again, I really just have to say to the honourable member, I'm afraid not only did he let policing and communities down by taking neighbourhood police off the streets, they also let police down in terms of the funding as well. And this government is given the increase in police funding of up to £1 billion next year, on top of the additional funding that we had to provide for policing this financial year because his party left a huge black hole, not just in the Home Office funding, not just in police officer funding, but also in the overall funding for public services across the board. A shameful legacy we have had to turn around.
Brett Leishman.
Question for you, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we engage regularly with the Fire Brigades Union, and we take very seriously the health and safety of those firefighters who risk their lives for our communities every day. The Home Office is reviewing recent academic research to evaluate risks posed by contaminants and the effectiveness of decontamination procedures, and we will share our findings with the fire and rescue authorities who hold the legal responsibility to protect firefighters against those risks.
Round Isham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for her answer. Exposure to toxic substances is an avoidable risk, and every firefighter should have access to the resources they need to protect themselves. The dangerous nature of being a firefighter has also been amplified as the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service have had more than 1,400 frontline firefighter jobs cut since 2010, a reduction of nearly 20%. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that the Fire Service needs proper investment and a national body with legal standing to set standards on fire cover, training, equalities and health and safety?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Police Minister, is looking at all fire and rescue issues and considering all possibilities, including potential reorganisations as we move the service forwards.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And could the Minister look at early diagnosis for firefighters? Because very sadly, many of them suffer very bad ill health in retirement. But if they are diagnosed early, then treatment can be provided and obviously lengthen their lives and the quality of their lives.
Mr Speaker, I agree that this is an important area and there has to be much more work done to look at the effect of contaminants and risks going forwards from the dangers that firefighters put themselves in every day to protect life.
Right, Helen Morgan.
Floor, please, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, with your permission, I will group this question with questions 14 and 18. We all understand the devastating harm that crime can cause in rural communities, and this government is committed to taking action. And that's why we'll be enacting the Equipment Theft Prevention Act to tackle the theft of agricultural machinery and equipment. We'll strengthen enforcement around fly tipping and antisocial behaviour, and we'll deliver more rural patrols through our neighbourhood policing guarantee.
Well, I thank the Minister for her answer. She will know that the funding for allocations for policing are based on reported crime and not on underlying crime rates. And in rural areas like North Shropshire, people report that they don't always report a crime when it happens. Residents in Oswestry and Whitchurch have told me that they don't bother to phone the police because they don't think anyone's coming. So will the Minister consider reassessing that formula to ensure that in rural areas the funding reflects the level of underlying crime that's going on?
Minister.
Well, can I just reassure the Honourable Lady that funding for the year 25-26 for her police force will be at £316.3 million. So that is an increase of £18 million on the figures from this year. And of course, I would encourage all people who are victims of crime to report it. We need to have that information so the police can then make the resources available that are required.
Jenny Riddle-Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In my constituency of Suffolk Coastal, fly tipping on farms and private land and the targeted theft of heating oil is causing real and profound problems for families and businesses alike. Will the Minister update me on the progress to tackle rural crime, and will the Department consider setting up a rural task force working cross-departmentally to tackle these issues?
So I absolutely share my honourable friend's concerns about the extent of rural crime and particularly fly tipping, because we've seen recent research that shows that 80% of farmers are saying that they are affected by fly tipping, and I'm particularly again concerned about the targeted theft of heating oil to families and business at this time of year. So as I've said, we'll be strengthening neighbourhood policing and we'll see more patrols in rural areas, which will help. And we're also going to have forthcoming legislation to provide DEFRA with the powers that they need to support local authorities in exercising new fly tipping enforcement powers.
Charlotte Kent.
Thank you. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss the effect that rural crime, particularly hair coursing and, as we've heard today, theft from farms and sheds, has on residents in Ely and East Cambridgeshire?
I'm always very happy to meet honourable members, and I would just point out to her that we have the National Wildlife Crime Unit, and it's been doing some very, very good work, including overseeing the police national response to hare coursing and Operation Galileo, which has resulted in a 40% reduction in offences in that area. But I'm very happy to meet.
Mr. Shockat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Right across the towns and villages I represent, people have seen that as the rural policing presence has declined, we've seen predictable increases in shoplifting, antisocial behaviour, farm break-ins and fright events. We cannot allow this to be just tolerated. So what steps will the Minister be taking to make sure my local police have got the resources and powers they need to take these crimes seriously?
Well, of course, the neighbourhood policing guarantee doesn't just apply to towns and cities, and it will apply to rural communities. So we will see far more of a police presence out and about in those communities. And I also just wanted to say that the Home Office is currently working with the National Police National Police Chiefs Council on the rural and wildlife crime strategy to crack down on some of the crime and disorder that we've seen get worse over recent years.
Monica Harding.
Question 5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And burglary is a particularly invasive crime which has a profound impact on the security of individuals, and I know that personally myself, as well as the wider community. But for too long, a culture has been allowed to develop in our country where victims of burglary and other crimes fear that even if they report what has happened, no one will come and nothing will be done. So that's the culture that we're determined to tackle through our Safer Streets mission and our commitment to neighbourhood policing.
Monica Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my local authority, 92% of burglaries went unsolved, with police failing to identify a suspect. The worst figures for any community in the country. In Surrey, 63% of burglaries were not even attended by police. This has contributed to a decline in confidence in local policing amongst my constituents. So how specifically will the government's new police performance unit and the government's neighbourhood policing guarantee ensure that my constituents in East and Water can feel safe in their homes? And will the Minister join with my party and commit to a statutory burglary response guarantee to ensure all domestic burglaries are attended by a police officer?
So the police have made a commitment in England and Wales that they will attend the scene of every home burglary. So I am concerned to hear what the Honourable Lady has just said about her local force. And of course the College of Policing has set out good practice that should be followed by police forces around the investigation of burglaries, including setting standards of what should be expected, as well as dealing with issues like how you deal with victims, because that's really important as well. So I'm very mindful of what the Honourable Lady has said to me, and I will write to her, I think, with some further details about what more can be done.
Dr. Danny Chambers.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Anybody? Oh, Minister, welcome.
Apologies. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will group this response with questions 12 and 25. This government will treat violence against women and girls as a national emergency that it is, and our new comprehensive violence against women and girls strategy later this year will spell out how we plan to meet our unprecedented commitment to halve that violence. In the interim, we have announced Reneem's Law, where domestic abuse specialists will be embedded within 999 control rooms, and we are working with police to develop a national framework to track and target high-harm offenders. We are piloting new domestic abuse protection orders in selected areas, and we have outlined new measures to protect women against stalking and spiking.
Dr. Danny Chambers.
Mr. Speaker, the entire country was appalled at the terrible crime of girls being groomed by gangs of older men, and they were outraged at the lack of action taken by authorities to help protect these victims. Now, there's been about 10 years since these crimes first came to light, and since then we've had the J inquiry, which has made 20 recommendations. Will the government commit to implementing all the recommendations in full and at pace to help protect future victims?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for both his tone and sentiment. It is one that I would hope that everybody in this House would absolutely agree with, and I spent my weekend, in fact, in my own surgery dealing with cases as live today around grooming of both boys and girls by organised groups of varying different sorts. And he is absolutely right. It's actually 15 years since the original J report into Rotherham. On the question of the ICSA recommendations, we will work absolutely at pace with the stakeholders, including the victims, to make sure, and by that I mean also Professor Alexis Jay, to make sure that what was intended by those recommendations can happen. I will do it as quickly as can possibly be done, but I will not do what has previously been done by the previous government, is just say, yeah, sure, and then leave it to chance.
Alison Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. North Yorkshire is the largest rural county in the country. Behind the beauty of our villages and hamlets in my constituency of Scarborough and Whitby lies an ugly truth, that on average victims in rural areas are subject to domestic abuse for 25% longer than victims in urban areas, and half as likely to report it. Can the Minister reassure the House that more funding to tackle rural domestic violence is part of the government's strategy to halve violence against women and girls?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady and say that the strategy to halve violence against women and girls is for every single part of our country. The government recognises that victims in rural and remote areas face particular barriers in fleeing abuse and accessing support. We are already driving forward a range of activities that will support rural victims. The Victims and Prisoners Act will require local commissioners to develop joint needs assessments for victims of domestic abuse to identify gaps in support, and I would encourage all members to engage with that process when it comes to your local area, and would happily work with rural MPs in this House to make sure that's the case.
Steve Witham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Palestinian women detained in Israeli prisons face sexual assault, beatings and threats of rape and death, according to United Nations reports. Given our commitment to tackling violence against women and girls, what discussions is the Minister having with FCDO colleagues about the implications of the gender-based violence faced by Palestinians, particularly as Israel continues to deny access to detention sites?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his questions, and the FCDO colleagues sit on the violence against women and girls subgroup of the mission that we have. But what I can say is that I have every faith that my colleagues in the FCDO take the issues that he is talking about incredibly seriously, and that we have to protect women the world over.
Danny Kruger.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. A consistent finding of the serious case reviews into child sexual exploitation is that the authorities have turned a blind eye in cases where they believe that a child, often as young as 13, is in a consensual sexual relationship with an older man. And, of course, we know that whether the girl believes or she's giving consent or not, the adult is committing a criminal offence. Does the Minister agree that one way we might stop the next child sex rape gang is by insisting that in all cases adults who have sex with children are investigated and prosecuted?
Minister?
Absolutely, and from my years working on the front line, the boyfriend model of consent to gain access to get the young people into these groups is undoubtedly one of the most common in that field. So I absolutely agree that any case where any adult has sex with any child, that they should be investigated, charged and convicted. One of the things that we will do as a main fundamental part of our violence against women and girls strategy is around prevention and working with young people who are a growing cohort of both abusers and victims in this space to ensure that we are acting to prevent, not just protect.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to keeping children and especially girls safe from violence and abuse, there's been a lot of talk about inquiries over the last week, and indeed some comments have been more constructive than others. Inquiries can be a really powerful tool for uncovering the truth about injustice, but they will only reach their full potential when there is a duty of candour that requires public officials and authorities to cooperate fully. The Government has already committed to bringing this into force. So, Mr Speaker, can the Minister and her colleagues commit to a timeline for introducing the Hillsborough Law to Parliament?
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady, and actually in a number of national public inquiries that we've had, for example, into Hillsborough, where actually still nobody has been held accountable, shows the importance of the Hillsborough Law and the duty of candour. I will make sure, obviously we have committed to it in our manifesto, and it will absolutely be done by this government. We will keep in touch in due course about when the timeline for that is.
Greg Smith.
Number 7, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I commend the honourable gentleman's work in bringing forward this legislation and reiterate this government's commitment to safeguarding rural communities? We will implement the Equipment Theft Prevention Act of 2023 and fully support its intentions to tackle the theft and resale of high-value equipment, particularly for use in an agricultural setting.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Minister for his kind words and the government's support for Was My Private Member's Bill Now Act. But that Act had its commencement date in January last year, but requires a statutory instrument to be moved to bring it into full force. So can I ask the Minister, when will that statutory instrument be moved? And can he assure me that there isn't some delay because of the equipment manufacturers who, of course, benefit massively from crime because they get to sell another one, causing this delay?
Minister.
Thank you. Let me reassure the honourable gentleman. As he knows, the Act requires secondary legislation to take effect, and we are currently considering the views of those who may be affected by the legislation, but we intend that the regulations will be in place by the summer.
Adam Jogi.
Thank you, Speaker. Question 8.
Minister.
We are strengthening how we tackle crime throughout the country, including in Newcastle-under-Lyme. Our Safer Streets mission aims to halve knife crime and violence against women and girls and restore confidence in the criminal justice system. The Youth Futures programme will divert young people from a life of crime, and the Neighbourhood Policing Guarantee will deliver an additional 13,000 neighbourhood policing roles.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I say how excellent it is to see our honourable friend from Yardley in her place on the front bench. Mr Speaker, I've heard from many constituents in recent days about their concerns of the grooming of young people, particularly young women, concerns that clearly all of us in this House share. Now, with only 6.9% of violent or sexual crime solved in the West Midlands in the year ending June 2024, can I ask the Minister specifically what steps are being taken to hold the thugs to account and to protect young people, particularly young women and girls in Newcastle-Lyme, so they can live their lives safely?
Minister.
Well, I echo the comments of my honourable friend about my honourable friend, the Safeguarding Minister. And on this particular point, I think there's a very interesting article in the papers today where she's quoted, and I just want to read this, what she says. She says it's completely unacceptable that fewer and fewer violent and sexual crimes are being solved, with more victims being let down time and time again. And I cannot think of a better champion to actually take the work forward to protect those young women in particular than the Safeguarding Minister.
This will be wizardry in its way it will be delivered. Sir Julian.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister accept that it would greatly assist the police to investigate crime in Newcastle-under-Lyme and indeed elsewhere if they were not spending an estimated 60,000 hours investigating and recording so-called non-crime hate incidents?
Minister.
Well, we've said from the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, myself as the Policing Minister, that we want a common sense approach to the way these matters are dealt with. The Government has been very clear. We have set out our priorities as the incoming Government: halving knife crime, halving violence against women and girls, restoring confidence in the criminal justice system, and one of the big issues for me is around antisocial behaviour and tackling that through our neighbourhood policing guarantee.
Jonah Reid.
Question number 9, Mr Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we remember those who have lost their lives to knife crime, including 17-year-old Thomas Taylor, killed in Bedford, and 14-year-old Kellyan Bokassa, killed in Woolwich just last week. Kellyan's mother said, "I tried to prevent it. I tried so many times." Mr. Speaker, no mother should live with that grief or feel that level of fear for a teenage son. That's why this government has set up a coalition to tackle knife crime, involving families alongside new action on serious violence.
Sorry, Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for that answer, and of course my sympathies go out to the mother this weekend. Recently published data showed a sharp rise in serious violent crime in Scotland, particularly in our cities and towns. Too many of my constituents feel unsafe in East Kilbride town centre and village, particularly at night. Meanwhile, the SNP government's chronic underfunding of Police Scotland has resulted in officer numbers at their lowest level since 2008. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the SNP now has the funding in place to increase police numbers, and that protecting our community and citizens should be its priority?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is right that the... I do apologise, Mr. Speaker. This is grouped with question 22. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to raise this. The Scottish Government does have a significant increase in funding, so they can take action to improve public services. This government has made it a mission to halve knife crime over the next decade, including taking action to get dangerous weapons like zombie knives and ninja swords off our streets and preventing the unlawful sale of these lethal blades, particularly to children.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Whitley had their Christmas disrupted by an alarming threat of knife crime. And we've seen too many tragedies of this kind already occur in Reading over the last few years. So I wholeheartedly welcome the government's mission to halve knife crime. I've also applied for my constituency of Early and Woodley to be a trial location for the new respect orders. Will the Home Secretary meet with me and my constituents to discuss how we tackle the root problems that cause people, particularly young people, to carry knives on them?
Well, I will happily talk to my honourable friend further about this, and so too with the policing minister. She is right that we need to prevent young people carrying knives in the first place, but also to make sure that there is swift intervention and that it is harder for them to get knives in the first place. We're also taking action working with police forces across the country to tackle knife-enabled robbery, which is one of the areas that has seen the biggest increases in recent years.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary very much for that response? Over the past 5 years, there's been 900 convictions for knife-related crimes in Northern Ireland. It's an epidemic in Northern Ireland. Almost 200 convictions in the last year alone. So can I ask the Home Secretary, what discussions has the Home Secretary been able to have with the necessary authorities, including the PSNI in Northern Ireland, to help us address this issue as well? Thank you so much.
Secretary.
Well, the honourable member will know that this is an issue that PSNI takes extremely seriously, and the issues of knife crime are devastating to families, but he is right to be deeply concerned about some of the increases that we have seen. And also, just frankly, it is still far too easy for young people to get hold of knives. That's why we asked Commander Stephen Clayman to conduct a detailed review into online sales and delivery of knives, and we expect his report back shortly.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Home Secretary, a nurse was stabbed in an ED in Oldham over the weekend as well. Will the Home Secretary join me in condemning any attack on our health and social care workers, but especially at the weekend?
Home Secretary.
The honourable member makes an extremely important point. Our public servants, and particularly our nursing, our medical staff, work to save lives, work to support people, work to make sure that they can help patients, and they do so with a position of trust that people who come to see them are asking for their help. He is right to talk about the devastating attack that we saw in Oldham in the hospital there, and I think all of us will be thinking about the nurse and about all of the colleagues and all of those working in the hospital, and about the police investigation that I know is underway.
Rosie Duffield. Minister.
Mr Speaker, with your permission, I would like to group question 10 with question 24. The Government, of course, is committed to tackling antisocial behaviour and the harm and misery that we all know it causes in communities. This is part of our Safer Streets mission that will introduce respect orders and put 13,000 additional police officers, PCSOs and special constables into neighbourhood policing roles so that each community has a visible presence and an accountable police team.
Rosie Duffy.
Thank you. Last year, on average, at least 3 instances of antisocial behaviour per day were reported to Kent Police in the city centre of Canterbury alone. We have great beat officers who I know keep our city as safe as they can. But given that the economy of our historic UNESCO city relies so heavily on tourism, how will the Government work with Kent Police to further tackle this issue so that residents, businesses and visitors feel safer?
Minister.
I think the Honourable Lady makes a very important point about how antisocial behaviour, particularly in areas where we have lots of tourists, has to be tackled, and that's why the neighbourhood policing guarantee, the additional 13,000 police officers, PCSOs and specials that we'll see in our town centres, city centres, rural areas by the end of this Parliament are so important. And just to say so, within the provisional policing settlement that was announced just before Christmas, there is £100 million to policing to start that recruitment of the 13,000 police officers.
Coyle.
Safer Streets mission is delivered in communities like mine in Southwark, where officers are extracted too often to police protests, and the Met is divided between its neighbourhood and its national policing roles.
And my honourable friend makes a very important point, particularly around the conflicting and competing interests in the Metropolitan Police. So we have committed to putting police back on the beat, as I was just saying, through the neighbourhood policing guarantee. And the neighbourhood policing team will be in every area. It will be out policing, intelligence-led, visible patrols, and ensuring that officers are protected from being deployed elsewhere. That is part of the guarantee.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Question number 13.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government is committed to reducing hotel use through reform of the asylum system, including streamlining asylum processing and establishing the Border Security Command to tackle people smuggling gangs at source. Since the general election, there's been a net increase of 6 hotels in use. However, 9 are scheduled for closure by the end of March.
Sir Ashley.
Mr Speaker, the Government's new policy of smashing the gangs has enabled them to close 7 asylum hotels, but unfortunately they've had to open another 14. Could the Minister tell us when the number of asylum seekers in hotel accommodation will be lower than when she took office?
Mr Speaker, due to the size of the backlog we inherited from the party opposite, which was an asylum system in chaos, with tens of thousands of people in limbo and very little processing happening, it's going to take, it can't be solved overnight. But we are working very, very hard to close hotels. I just gave the honourable member the figures. It will be down 9 more scheduled to close by the end of March, and there's been a net increase of 6, so by the end of March there will be fewer.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The previous government wasted a scandalous amount of public money on asylum accommodation. For example, in North Eye, where they paid double what the previous owners had paid without even checking that the building didn't have asbestos, contaminated ground and couldn't even be used. Will the Minister commit to being more effective in using public value for money to ensure the taxpayers' money is not wasted as we fix the asylum backlog?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I certainly will. Remember also the 60 million that the party opposite wasted on RAF Scampton and the 15 million on Bexhill, which was a derelict, asbestos-ridden former prison. We won't take any lessons, Mr Speaker, from them about value for money in government expenditure.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, we understand that we must do our bit to help house asylum seekers. But the Ramada Hotel on Penn's Lane has always been the wrong place because it is too far away from inner-city Birmingham-based services.
Under the last government, this facility was slated for closure. So I asked the Minister to look urgently at winding it down and closing it as soon as possible.
Mr. Speaker, it's our intention to close all hotels as soon as possible once we deal with the backlog that we inherited from the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Asylum accommodation hotels were once emergency measures but have now lasted several years due to the mess the Tories made of our asylum system. Well, the scrapping of the Rwanda scheme and recommencing the processing of claims has led to a substantially lower backlog than would have been had we continued with the Tory policies. There is still much more to do. Can the Minister update me on progress towards ending asylum hotel accommodation and cutting waiting times for asylum application decisions?
Minister. Well, we inherited a system, Mr. Speaker, where very few decisions were being made. We've ramped up decision making to over 11,000 a month now, and we are dealing with the backlog. But backlogs can't be abolished overnight, and there are also appeals backlogs. So it's a huge mess we inherited, but we are methodically getting through it.
Shadow Minister Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Housing asylum seekers in hotels, and there were 6,000 more in just the first 3 months of this government, is spectacularly expensive. The Home Secretary's policy, then, is to make asylum decisions quickly, so any costs of the migrants she accepts can instead be hidden in the welfare system. The Home Office itself admits in its impact assessments that it has no idea how much her policy will cost in benefits claims and council housing bills. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister commit today to recording and publishing all these costs for migrants whose asylum claims she accepts?
Minister.
I don't think, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take any lessons on money from the party opposite, who spent £700 million to send 4 volunteers to Rwanda and left huge backlogs and over 90,000 stopped asylum claims, people in hotels without being able to leave because they were trying to get their fantasy Rwanda programme off the ground.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Mahida and her 3 children are asylum seekers from Syria, and they are living in one of the 2 asylum hotels in my Hazel Grove constituency. They've been living in limbo for 9 months now as they wait for a decision on their asylum claim, and, like all Syrian asylum seekers, their applications have been temporarily paused following the fall of Assad. Now, many in my community are keen to support those seeking asylum, but they are also very keen to see an end to the use of hotels. The cost of housing families in this way is too high, both to the mental well-being of those living there and to the taxpayer. So will the Minister let the House know what circumstances she is waiting for asylum applications from Syria to be resumed and when she expects that to be?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the fall of the Assad regime was a welcome development since he was a tyrant, but there's 5,500 Syrian asylum seekers currently in our system, many of whom fled the Assad regime. Until the future in Syria becomes a little more settled, it's very difficult to try to decide those claims, which is why both this country and most of Europe have had a temporary pause while the situation in Syria settles and develops. So I can't stand here and tell her exactly when. All I can say is we're keeping it under very close observation, and as soon as there is any development in this area, we will make sure that the House knows about it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 15.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Labour government is determined to put right the appalling injustices suffered by members of the Windrush community. We will make sure that those affected receive the compensation they rightly deserve and ensure cultural change is embedded permanently into the Home Office. At the end of November 2024, the amount paid to individuals was over £100 million across almost 3,000 claims under the Windrush Compensation Scheme. We've also re-established the Windrush Unit to drive forward the action needed to ensure that what happened to the Windrush generation never happens again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Members of the Windrush generation who struggle to submit compensation claims do not have access to legal aid, leaving them unable to navigate the complex process. I've recently been contacted by a constituent who is struggling to navigate the claims process and has no other support available to him. So what steps is the Minister taking to tackle these barriers, and will she commit to provide additional support to ensure every eligible individual can access the scheme regardless of their capacity or circumstances?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and it is exactly the reason why we are committed to making changes so that the scheme is accessible and that victims of the Windrush scandal are far better supported in applying for compensation. It's why in July we brought in a new single named caseworker approach to streamline the process, improve consistency, remove duplication, and why we announced £1.5 million of grant funding for organisations to provide extra support for applicants. If she would like to meet to discuss her constituent's case further, I would be very happy to do so.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Of course, the Windrush scandal, Mr Speaker, involved people coming to this country in good faith, who were then falsely labelled as illegal immigrants. And one of the things the Minister could do to avoid such circumstances happening again is to make it easier for people to come here through a reduction in the English language requirement. Is that something she would consider, please?
I thank the honourable member for his question. Our priority is to understand and learn from the events that took place in the past and focus on the future by ensuring that the department is inclusive and considers the impact of all its work on people from every background.
Thank you.
Number 16,
Mr Speaker, the Government is committed to bringing down net migration after it hit record highs under the last government. We will do this by taking a different approach, linking skills and migration policy so that immigration is not used as an alternative to tackling workforce problems in the UK. The Home Office publishes Migrant Journey Analysis, which shows that the proportion of migrants granted indefinite leave to remain over time, helping to inform who might seek to remain in the UK in the long term.
Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The mass import of low-skilled workers could cost the taxpayer more than £61 billion, a financial ticking time bomb. Will the Minister commit here and now to extending the qualifying period for indefinite leave to remain or to bringing in new qualifying criteria?
Minister.
I must say to the honourable gentleman that he would do well to hold his own side to account for the record that they had on net migration. The Government recognises and values the contribution that legal migration makes to our country, and there's always a place for overseas recruitment for firms looking to grow. But it must not be the first port of call, and we must make sure that our migration system is controlled, managed and fair.
Thank you so much.
Shadow Home Secretary Criswell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Since the Government came to office, 23,000 illegal migrants have crossed the English Channel, an increase of 29% compared to the same time last year. Does the Government now accept the National Crime Agency's advice that a deterrent is needed, like the Rwanda scheme, which they cancelled before it even started? Now, the government last week were trumpeting their removals figures. Will they honestly accept that only a tiny fraction of removals relate to people that arrived by small boat? In fact, in their first 3 months, only the removals amounted to only 5% of people who entered the UK by small boat. And will she accept that allowing 95% of small boat arrivals to stay is no deterrent at all?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the Shadow Home Secretary appears to have forgotten what happened when he was in government. In fact, for the first 6 months of this year, he will know that the numbers of those arriving on small boats was the highest for any 6 months on record. He will know also that the government spent over £700 million on a failed Rwanda scheme that saw 4 volunteers go to Rwanda. I won't take any lessons from the Shadow Home Secretary, Mr Speaker. They should take responsibility for their record and they should apologise for it.
Jill Furness.
Topical number 1, please.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Immigration and asylum rules need to be respected and enforced, and for too long that has not happened. Since the general election, we have ramped up the removals for those who have no right to be in the United Kingdom, with 16,400 individuals successfully returned in the first 6 months of this government, the highest level of returns over a 6-month period since 2018. Wider work to strengthen border security is underway, including the new sanctions regime to target smuggling gangs announced by the Foreign Secretary, and new cooperation agreements, including with France, Germany, Italy, Iraq and beyond. Because vile criminal smuggler gangs operate across borders, law enforcement needs to cooperate across borders too to bring them down.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Knife crime continues to have a devastating impact on all too many lives in Sheffield. I recently chaired a roundtable in my constituency which brought together local leaders, police, schools and voluntary organisations who are all on the front line of this. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it's vital to work together in these key stakeholders so we can build a collaborative approach to ending knife crime once and for all?
Secretary.
I do agree with my honourable friend. That's why we have set up the coalition to tackle knife crime. Is also why we have a knife-enabled robbery task force working with chief constables. And at local level, we have discussed setting out youth prevention partnerships, part of the Young Futures programme, so that all organisations can come together and be part of a mission to halve knife crime over the next 10 years.
Shadow Home Secretary Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the thoughts of the whole House will be with the victims of the grooming and rape gangs. So will the Home Secretary now agree with the Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and the Labour MP for Liverpool Walton that we do need a proper national public inquiry? The ICSA report only touched on grooming gangs and only covered 6 of the towns affected. Local inquiries, such as the Manchester one that the Home Secretary and Prime Minister referred to, do not have the legal powers to compel the production of evidence, which is why the Manchester chairs resigned. One Oldham victim, Jane, who was groomed and gang raped at the age of 12, has called for a full national inquiry.
Mr. Phil, it's topicals. You could have got this in earlier in a lengthier question. I think the first part of your question was absolutely accurate. You can't just roll on at top of nobody else is going to get in. Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are horrendous crimes involving rape, sadistic violence and cruelty, exploitation, intimidation and coercion. So we need action, truth and accountability for these terrible crimes. That is why we support further investigations, inquiries and action into child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs, including new action to get police reporting evidence on the scale of grooming gangs, including on ethnicity, which has still not been done. And the most important thing is to get more police investigations to get these criminals behind bars.
Does the Home Secretary agree that it is untenable for the government's own anti-corruption minister to be under investigation for benefiting from the proceeds of corruption, and should she stand down while this investigation continues?
Home Secretary.
Well, he will know that the Minister has referred herself to the Ministerial Code inquiry, and that is the appropriate way for this to be addressed. I would say more broadly, we take seriously the full range of crimes that face our country and will continue to work closely with the police to always take action against crime.
Sarah Coombs.
Mr. Speaker, with a rise in disinformation and intimidation at home and interference from abroad, it has never been more important to stand up for our British democracy. So can I therefore ask the Minister to give us an update on the Defending Democracy Task Force?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a top priority to protect our country and our elected representatives from interference, intimidation and harassment. The Defending Democracy Task Force brings together a cross-government response to these threats. We will use all the tools at our disposal to protect our democratic security and resilience.
Last week's
Parliament passed a motion calling for action on immigration to address the needs of Scotland's employers, communities and public services, with a particular reference to rural visa pilots. As the Secretary of State knows, every sector in Scotland are crying out for Scottish solutions to distinct Scottish issues and problems. So what is her response to this democratically passed motion other than she's not interested?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for his question and will shortly be visiting Scotland as well to discuss these issues. He will know that we will not be introducing a Scottish visa scheme or devolving control of immigration policy. And he'll know also that the Migration Advisory Committee has found that the labour market needs are very similar across the UK and continues to engage at length with many UK stakeholders, including from Scotland.
Tom Rutland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The brilliant Ada Ukraine Support Association have raised concerns with me that the 18-month limit on the extension of Ukrainians' permission to remain in the UK is causing issues in securing tenancies, jobs and undergraduate university courses, which of course last for a minimum of 3 years. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss this issue facing Ukrainians in my constituency?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the UK support for Ukraine remains steadfast. The scheme will provide an additional 18 months temporary permission to Ukrainians here under one of the existing Ukraine schemes. Where a person's Ukraine scheme leave expires during their course and they are granted further leave to remain, for example on a student visa, they will continue to be able to complete their studies. I will be very happy to meet the Honourable Member to discuss this further.
Speaker, Dorset Police operates across over 1,000 square miles and yet, under the current funding settlement, receives far less money than urban areas with similar crime rates operating over smaller geographies. Will the Government commit to reviewing the funding settlement to ensure that rural areas like West Dorset get a fair settlement?
Minister.
Well, can I just say to the Honourable Gentleman that, of course, his force area is getting more money in the settlement that was announced just before Christmas. We clearly keep all formulas under consideration, and the Honourable Gentleman will know that we are going to go through a police reform package and programme, and finance will be part of that.
Rachel Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under the last government, my constituents had completely lost faith that foreign national offenders with no right to remain in this country would be swiftly removed. So I'm glad that since the last election, our new Labour government has enforced the return of over 2,500 foreign criminals, including serious and violent offenders, a 23% increase since last year. Can the Minister reassure my constituents that this government will not be taking its foot off the gas and will continue taking strong action? Yes, Mr. Speaker. Foreign nationals who commit offences and are sentenced to 12 months in prison have no right to be here, and I can assure my honourable friend that we will work tirelessly to ensure that they can be removed. So the 23% increase in 6 months is a good start. We won't take our foot off the gas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my Oxfordshire constituency of Didcot and Wantage, residents are concerned about increased antisocial behaviour, particularly pickpocketing and shoplifting in our towns. Given the last Conservative government cut the number of PCSOs in the Thames Valley area by more than half since 2015, what steps will the Minister be taking to ensure that the police are able to improve community policing in Oxfordshire towns such as Wallington, Wantage and Didcot?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we want to see an increase in neighbourhood policing right across the country. That's why we've set out £100 million as part of the police settlement for next year in order to kickstart and increase recruitment of neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs alongside stronger powers to tackle neighbourhood crime.
Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the government's plans to tackle in youth violence, but also prioritising early intervention? In Battersea, brilliant organisations like Carney's Community are delivering targeted services to young people, from mentoring, life skills, boxing and fitness. So does the Minister agree with me that organisations like this need our support? And will she agree to come and visit Carney so she can hear firsthand about how they are taking their approach to tackling youth violence?
I would be delighted to visit.
Sarah Bull.
Does the Secretary of State believe it is fair that undocumented illegal migrants get priority access to the NHS over British taxpayers?
Mr. Speaker, they don't.
Turner.
Since October 2023, my constituent has been separated from her husband and father of their children, who is a Palestinian citizen of the State of Israel. I have deep concerns over the Home Office's handling of this case, and the Home Office has not replied to my last 2 representations. Will she agree to look into this case?
Minister.
I thank Honourable Friend for raising his case. I'm very happy to meet with him to discuss the issues that he's raising.
Mr Speaker, Pencilwood in Glastonbury and Somerton is regularly blighted by unlicensed music events, leaving residents feeling frightened and vulnerable as organisers pay scant regard to them or the police. How will the Minister support the police to give the public the confidence that they will crack down on these illegal raves?
Minister.
If the Honourable Lady would like to write to me with details, I will certainly look into that.
Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Recently, the owner of social media site X has used his sizeable platform to undermine the democratic result of last July's general election, has stirred up hatred towards my right honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Yardley, putting her safety at risk, and has sought mechanisms to depose the Prime Minister. Can my right honourable friend say what actions the Defending Democracy Task Force is taking to prevent this kind of foreign interference in British politics?
Thank my honourable friend for this important question. The Government considers this work to be urgent. We've seen some utterly unacceptable activity both during and beyond the general election. I hope that work to address this should be a shared endeavour right across the House, but the Government is working at pace to address it.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What actions will the Home Secretary be taking following the news that 8 UK companies and organisations have been deemed terror groups by the United Arab Emirates?
The UAE is an important international partner for the UK, but of course other countries have their own rules on designation, and it would not be appropriate for the Government to comment on their processes. What I can say to the Honourable Member is that extremism has no place in our society, and that we work very closely with law enforcement, local communities and our international partners to tackle groups and any individuals who seek to sow division and hatred.
Mohammed Jasser.
My deepest condolences to the family and friends of 17-year-old Thomas Taylor, who was fatally stabbed in Bedford last week. Bedfordshire has some of the highest knife crime rates in the country. While I welcome increased funding for the force and the progress made in the tackling knife crimes in the region, will the Secretary of State ensure the special grants awarded to Bedfordshire Police in recognition of the high levels of serious violent crimes in the region are also maintained, and will she outline what further steps are being taken to deter young people from carrying lethal weapons?
Well, I think all of our thoughts will be with the family and friends of Thomas Taylor, who I know is my honourable friend's constituent. And he is right to say that we need comprehensive work to prevent knife crime, to prevent young people carrying knives in the first place, but then also to make sure that there is swift action where crimes take place.
Dr. Rupert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The National Crime Agency estimates £100 billion of illicit funds flow through the UK yearly. But despite the existence of the David Cameron-created unexplained wealth order, only 4 to 5 of these have ever been issued. That's 11 orders in total. So can my honourable friends just tell me what they're doing to stop them becoming, as they were under the Tories, pointless because we can't afford to use them?
Minister.
Amongst many other things, the Government has just appointed Baroness Hodge as the Government's anti-corruption champion. We'll be working very closely with her and other ministerial colleagues to address the items the Honourable Lady has raised.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Home Secretary confirm that none of her ministers or officials engaged with or are in touch with the Muslim Council of Britain, and there is no correspondence between Number 10, the Home Office and other departments about restoring ties with the organisation?
Thank you.
Yes, we can confirm that that is the case.
Gagan Mahindra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Several of my constituents in South Oxford have been, unfortunately, the victims of burglary or attempted burglary. Will the Home Secretary outline the measures her department has taken to allow the police to invest in technologies such as live facial recognition, which can make crimes such as burglary easier to solve?
Minister.
We are currently looking into whether there is a need for more regulation around live facial recognition, but I recognise that it is a very important tool that the police should have access to. But currently I've got a series of stakeholder meetings with various groups to discuss how we take this forward. But I do recognise how important it is and how it can be a really positive way of identifying and solving crimes.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I place on record my thanks to the right honourable friend from Yardley, who I know will ensure this government does more to tackle violence against women and girls than any other government. In doing so, will the government amend the strategy to consider prostitution and other forms of commercial sexual exploitations as violence against women and girls?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for her kind comments about me, and what I will say is that the violence against women and girls strategy that the government will launch later this year will absolutely root adult sexual exploitation, which so often actually stems from childhood sexual exploitation, into the government's violence against women and girls strategy for the first time ever.
Final question, Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Home Secretary aware of the growing link, as highlighted by a recent Durham University report, between rural crime and serious organised crime? And if she isn't, could she ask her officials to bring it to her attention? And given the transnational element to this serious organised crime, could the National Crime Agency start to take a closer look at rural crime?
Well, I am aware. I think this is a very serious issue. The links between the way in which serious organised crime has increasingly been targeting rural areas, has been targeting things like the GPS equipment used by farmers as well. And the point about serious organised crime is they will always target areas where they think they can get away with it. That's why this is partly about the work of the National Crime Agency. It's also about the work of police forces across the country and the work that we need to do to take forward a rural crime strategy with the NPCC.
That completes questions. Let from bench Chair Elba.